Yesterday, the Supreme Court granted a stay of injunction towards immigration enforcement, claiming that the following factors, in combination or simply by themselves, justify reasonable suspicion of questionable citizenship status. These factors include presence at particular locations such as bus stops, car washes, day labor pickup sites, agricultural sites, and the like, the type of work one does, speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, and apparent race or ethnicity. According to Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh, the government contends that the injunction will substantially hamper its efforts to enforce the immigration laws in the Los Angeles area. What does this mean? It means essentially that if immigration cannot racially profile people, then they can't do their job. This is ridiculous. You can't determine that someone is reasonably suspicious of being a non-citizen based off of their apparent race or ethnicity, nor from the language that they speak or the accent that they have. Let me provide an example. If someone speaks a language that you don't understand, that does not constitute reasonable suspicion that they're not from the United States. You could arrest someone because they sound foreign, only to find out that they're a native Gullah speaker. Gullah is a Creole that originates in the United States with African roots. It's where we get words like bussin', tote, gumbo, kumbaya. You know who's a native Gullah speaker? Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who voted in favor of this decision. That's the frustrating thing. The reason why we don't profile people based off of their race and ethnicity and the language that they speak is because it is not an accurate assessment as to whether or not someone's a citizen. Already, we've had 15 members of the Navajo Nation in Arizona and New Mexico being detained and questioned by ICE. We've had 3 members of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate tribe being detained without cause despite the fact that they presented IDs. And yet, Kavanaugh is claiming here that there isn't significant standing nor concern about using race as an effective metric for determining whether or not someone is suspicious of being a non-citizen. Later on in his concurrence, Kavanaugh says here, to be clear, apparent ethnicity alone cannot furnish reasonable suspicion. Under this court's case law regarding immigration stops, however, it can be a relevant factor when considered along with other salient factors. Under this court's precedents, not to mention common sense, I hate that phrase in legal discourse, it's incredibly subjective, those circumstances taken together can constitute at least reasonable suspicion of a legal presence in the United States. Kavanaugh is saying here that race and ethnicity is a factor when determining how suspicious someone is. That is racial profiling. That is racism. In the United States, we do have a problem that is endemic where we associate trustworthiness with skin tone. It is something that can be seen over and over again. It is often very intuitive and implicit, and people don't realize that they're applying that metric. You can go to other countries, certain parts of East Asia, and you'd be surprised how that mentality is not there. It is like night and day. It's very different. But here, Kavanaugh is saying that race and ethnicity can be a relevant factor, that the language that you're speaking can be a relevant factor when determining reasonable suspicion. That is racial profiling. That is racism. Later in his concurrence, Kavanaugh says something incredibly idealistic in my opinion, claiming that there isn't anything to worry about regarding immigration enforcement. Moreover, as for stops for those individuals who are legally in the country, the questioning in those circumstances is typically brief, and those individuals may promptly go free after making clear to the immigration officers that they are U.S. citizens or otherwise legally in the United States. However, in the dissent by Justice Sotomayor, she highlights several anecdotes of that very clearly not being the case, such as the case of Jorge Viramontes. On one occasion, an agent questioned Viramontes, asking if he is a citizen and requesting that he show his ID. Viramontes replied that he is a dual U.S. and Mexican citizen and supplied his California driver's license. The agent said the ID was insufficient, grabbed his arm, escorted him to a vehicle, and drove him to a warehouse area for further questioning. In Glendale, nearly a dozen masked agents with guns jumped out of cars at a Home Depot and began chasing and tackling Latino day laborers without identifying themselves as ICE or police, asking questions, or saying anything else. In downtown Los Angeles, agents jumped out of a van, rushed up to a tamale vendor, surrounded him, and handled him violently, all without asking any questions. On a broader scale, however, how many U.S. citizens have been unlawfully arrested, detained, or deported by ICE this year? Well, we have no official information on that. The DHS claims that number is 0. However, from the Government Accountability Office in 2021, I've found this information here, that from 2015 to 2020, ICE arrested 674, detained 121, and removed 70 potential U.S. citizens from the United States. Kavanaugh is effectively stating that immigration enforcement cannot do their job unless they're allowed to racially profile people, questioning people's legal status based off of their apparent race or ethnicity, or if they're speaking Spanish or English with an accent, which is not a determinant of citizenship. Speaking Spanish doesn't mean that you're a non-citizen, nor does speaking English mean that you are a citizen. What's so insulting about making sure that these agencies are allowed to use Spanish as a way to profile people as being non citizens is that there are so many Americans in California, Arizona, and New Mexico who have had family ties to this land prior to U.S. annexation following the Mexican American War in 1848. There are people who have been here longer than the English speakers, and yet they are the ones being questioned about their citizenship status. Now, this case is still pending appeal in the Ninth Circuit, but it is really unnecessary for the Supreme Court to grant a stay of injunction. It is an act of injustice, and there are reasons why we don't allow for racial profiling when it comes to law enforcement in this country.